Get out your high school algebra textbook and your TI-83 graphing calculator because we're going to put the engineer in mix engineer. What is the difference between phase and polarity, and why should you care? We'll start with this 500 hertz sine wave, which you should be able to hear pretty well on your phone. If I double this track, it gets louder. It has double the energy. But if I invert the polarity on one of these tracks, listen to what happens. Nothing. That's because as this one goes up, this one comes down, and on and on and on. This is polarity. It's the whole waveform is reflected over this horizontal axis. Imagine that anything above this line is the speaker cone coming out toward you. Anything below this line is the speaker cone going back in. If we give the speaker both of these sets of instructions at the same time, it's just not moving. So that's why we get complete cancellation. Think of sound waves as changes in air pressure. This same cancellation happens in open air. So if that's polarity, what is phase? Phase relates more to the vertical axis here. It's when multiple sound waves are arriving somewhere, like your ears, for example, but not at the exact same time. So let's put the polarity back here the way it originally was. I can shift the phase by just nudging either one of these sine waves in time. And you can hear that start to affect the tone of the combination of signals. These waves are they're just out of phase now. Even if I were to invert the polarity of one of them, I'm not going to get my twice as loud sine wave back. It's still not exactly the same because these waves are out of phase. And this is a lot more obvious in more complex waves, especially waves that aren't so symmetrical like this. Because if I push this far enough out of phase, it'll be back in phase. But that's not the case with a lot of waves that occur in nature or in the studio. So flipping the polarity is not always the solution when your waves are out of phase. In fact, it rarely is. Let's take a look at a real life scenario that we're all familiar with, the drum set. This is Ghost by Alex Prezzano, Aaron Drescher on drums. Let's just listen to a bit of the drums. And we'll solo the kick. Now you're probably really going to have headphones to be able to hear this, but listen to what happens when we put the overheads in. Kick gets thin, loses some bottom end, and it just doesn't sound as fat. And that's because the overheads and the kick close mic, they're just not perfectly in phase. Let's try this. Kick and overheads. We'll invert the polarity of the kick. It's different, but it's not quite a solution. But if I nudge the kick back, listen to the bottom end now. You see how these waves are kind of a little more in phase here. I'm not saying you always need to do this, but it's just the reality of when you're recording a multi-mic drum kit, you might have 6, 8, 10, 12 mics on a kit, and every time you hit a drum, the sound of that drum is going to arrive in all of the mics, at a slightly different time. You have close mics right up against the head, and you have overheads a few feet above the drums. The speed of sound is not that fast, so all of those sounds are going to arrive at different mics at different times. Drum kits have been recorded this way for a very long time. People were not nudging tracks into phase on tape, so a certain amount of this is just part of the drum sound, and it's going to be that way. But it is something to be aware of, and it's a good example of the difference between phase and polarity, and why flipping polarity is not a substitute for getting your sounds in phase.